Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Elliot Felix, CEO of Brightspot Strategy, a consultancy that focuses on attracting and retaining students by improving the student experience, their spaces, student services, and technology. He and his team have done this at multiple institutions, including MIT, NYU, NC State, and UVA, and they've touched over 1 million students in this process. Andrew and his team have had a major impact on institutions' enrollment and retention, and he joins us today to talk about how higher ed institutions can improve enrollment, retention, and graduation rates by redesigning the student experience for today's student. Elliot, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
We've had some good conversations on the phone, and I'm really looking forward to this. You've got a consulting firm that you're doing some incredible work with higher ed folks, especially around enrollment, retention, and graduation rates, student services, etc. It's a real big challenge for higher ed issues right now, isn't it?
It is. And I feel pretty lucky to have every day I get to learn stuff and help. And at Brightspot, we've been able to work with more than 100 colleges and universities to help, understand their student experience and then figure out, move the needle by changing the space, the student services, the staffing, the systems, sometimes all. And there's a lot of change, and it's great to be a part of the change.
It is, isn't it? Give us a little bit of background to kind of level set the audience on who you are and how you came to doing this thing.
Well, I actually started off as an architect, and I started working academic and cultural and public facilities. And after a while in the profession, I was frustrated because we didn't know enough about the people and the institutions we were designing for. So, given a charge to create, X amount of space and on what, but the why behind it, the who behind it, the how behind it was not there. So went to grad school at MIT and tried to fill that gap, learning more about people and institutions and how people work and learn. And then I found a really unique company that was kind of like a management consultancy and an architecture firm had a baby. And what we would do is write design briefs. So we would define the problem for the architect to solve by conducting the research, doing the benchmarking, looking at the trends, talking to people, surveying people, focus groups, ethnography, scenario plan. And I really enjoyed that work. I got to work on a lot of really interesting libraries and campus plans. But toward the end of that, I realized, this research and all this stakeholder engagement we were doing, it was uncovering lots of problems and lots of solutions. And we only had one tool in our toolbox to help, which was space. So I founded as a multi consulting firm where we could help not just with the facilities, but the student services and the staffing and the systems. And 12 years and 100 universities ago.
Well, that's really great. And, going back to what we're going to talk about today, the challenges around enrollment, retention, graduation, there's a lot of headwinds out there right now, the demographic cliff, mergers, closures, etc. I'm intrigued with your design philosophy and how that goes. And if I understand it right, the first thing is really understanding who your prospective students are. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I apply a design thing, transforming the spaces and the services and the staffing and the systems. And for us, design has 3 pillars. One is understanding people. The other is thinking holistically in systems. And the third is testing things out, trying things out, prototyping. And so it really starts with understanding the people.
So with that, you're looking at who the people are, what their needs, how are they different, etc. Tell us more.
When we do that research, it's pairing a lot of things together. It's always a mixed methods approach. So you want to go broad, say with a survey. Our recent national survey was kind of interesting. We found that student satisfaction is not yet back to pre-pandemic levels. Not that it's about going back. I think you and I agree on that. It's about moving forward. So you want to go broad, but you also want to go deep, interviews and workshops and focus groups. You also want to pair qualitative and quantitative. You want to understand the student story, but you also want to look at the data. And you also want to go objective, subjective, right? So what's the data on the transactions? How many advising appointments are you doing? How many laptops are getting checked out? But also, how satisfied are people with advising and technology? And then finally, you want to go internal, external. Internal inside the institution. So what are the students, the faculty, the staff, even the alumni, the corporate partners, what are they saying? And then externally, what are the changes? What are the benchmarking? What does that tell us about the external environment and the trends? So it's a mixed method approach, trying to understand students and faculty and staff, who they are, what are their expectations, what are their motivations, what are their needs, and how are those changing?
It's interesting because what I'm hearing you describe is very similar to what, when we work with boards of directors, we come in and we'll say, listen, when you've seen one board, you've seen one board. And it sounds to me the same thing when you're looking at it from a student services, from an enrollment, retention perspective. When you've seen one university, you've seen one university.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And it's interesting. I was just talking to our team about one of the seminal books in my consulting career, which was written by an MIT emeritus professor, Edgar Schein. He coined organizational culture, 50 years ago, and is a pillar in organizational consulting. And one of his principles in process consultation is access your ignorance, which I think is such a fantastic way to work with someone, because on the one hand, you want to bring your expertise. You want to be looking for the patterns. We're talking to this university about student services, and the idea of a one-stop shop, hasn't come up yet. So let me ask about that. So on the one hand, you have this experience, you have this expertise. On the other hand, you have to access and really take full advantage of your ignorance and have the beginner's mind, have that curiosity to ask questions, and to not just see how is this university like all the others, but how is it unique, the curriculum, the culture, the campus. And I think that it's so important that, when you've seen one university, you've seen one university.
And it's so interesting because what I'm hearing you say is Johari window kind of stuff.
Oh, I love the Johari window. Love it.
And for those, for those of us who are neophytes with it, it's what you know, what somebody else knows, what you both know, and what neither of you know.
Yes.
And it's getting down to, and that's why you do the qualitative, not so much quantitative, but doing qualitative stuff to find out what nobody really knows. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think just in the same way that a great leader has a really big Johari window, right? They have great self-awareness and they're also very transparent. I think so too with a great college or university. It's always taking steps, whether it's their Office of Institutional Research and Assessment or using outside consultants or some combination, but they're always trying to understand themselves and broaden that picture of who they are and where they are, where they're headed. And I think the one thing I'll add to this is that so far we've been talking about research and stakeholder engagement and benchmarking to understand people, but there's also an opportunity to go beyond that, not just understand those people to help identify their problems, but to solve them together. And I think enlisting the power of students and faculty and staff to come up with ideas about the future is really important too, that's a key part of design thinking, is that co-creating aspect.
People support what they help create.
Amen. Yeah.
And so you've worked with a lot of schools, 110.
when we crossed the 100 barriers, we had a little party, which was
Nice.
kind of fun. But yeah, and every school is a little bit different, but it's been fun working with all these different colleges and universities over the years and helping them change.
What are you seeing generally across institution that work for improving enrollment, retention, and graduation rates?
Well, we were saying every college and university is a little bit different in the specifics, the challenges they face, and the solutions, the strategies and tactics to address them. But I think there are some common themes. And the first one is belonging, which I think is so important. And there's a lot of great research and scholarship on this. I love Dr. Terrell Strayhorn's College Student Sense of Belonging is a great place to start with folks that are trying to understand that. He talks about belonging as feeling like you matter, like you're cared for, like you're part of something, like you're enough. And I think there's really something to that, because belonging, that's the lens that students see their experience through. So if they feel like they're part of something, if they feel like they matter, if they feel like they're supported, then
the experiences they have are going to reinforce that. And that's going to be the foundation for them to build relationships, to learn, to build skills, to build a network, to find a career path. And if they don't, then, each of those experiences, each of those interactions is potentially taking them down instead of up. And the National Health Assessment, National College Health Assessment shows only 65% of students feel a sense of belonging. And this is a pretty broad, it's 70,000 students. So it's a pretty broad survey. It's less so for some groups. I think survey of student engagement that a couple years ago started tracking belonging. They put it much higher at like 80%. I still think that's really a place to focus, because we know belonging has a huge impact on retention. I think one thing that Nessie found is that students who felt that sense of belonging, 40 or so % more likely to continue from first to second year. Most of the attrition happens. So focusing on belonging is a trend we're seeing, and something we're helping folks work on. And, there's a lot of different ways to work on it.
What are some of the ways that you can help instill within students a sense of belonging?
Really, you need a multifaceted approach, because space plays a role. So things like identity centers, affinity centers for LGBTQ plus students, for first-gen students, for student veterans, for student parents, they can play a huge role in belonging. And we know from our surveys, that's one of the things that students are the least satisfied with. Of the 68 metrics that we track, that's the second lowest at only 44% satisfaction. But the good news is we also know from a different study, about half of institutions are planning to improve or build a new identity center in the coming years. So I think space can play a role both for a specific community, potentially an underserved community, but also common space, student union, library, because a place and space can help create that sense of belonging, but so can the things that happen in it, events and programs that draw students together, support student organizations, peer-to-peer relationships, peer-to-peer service delivery, whether it's meeting with a peer advisor or a peer mentor, meeting with an RA in your residence hall, delivering support services like, going to the writing center, going to a tutoring session. So I think it's really about a multifaceted approach to belonging that's inclusive of space, of support services, of events, of programs. Basically, you want to give students lots of different ways to build those relationships, build those connections, because if they feel that sense of connection, then you're certainly more likely to retain them.
And I heard you reference a number of times support for students.
Right.
I suspect this is probably another pretty good bucket, being able to provide those services for students.
Right. Yeah. Belonging is kind of the foundation. I think then the next step up is that sense of support. And we know that from the National Survey of Student Engagement, what they term the supportive environment, which has to do with the availability of like learning support services, student contact with each other and with instructors, support for well-being, we know that that's the strongest predictor of their success, has the highest correlation. And what's interesting is like colleges and universities offer so much support to students. One of the reasons I wrote my book was to help students and parents understand all the great things that colleges and universities offer, because in the consulting work that I do, so many of these awesome things go unused, or at least underused, like using the Writing Center, going to the Career Center, talking to your advisor, not just once a semester when it's time to register, but throughout. And so universities and colleges have an opportunity to support their students with this full range of things, whether it's tutoring, writing, advising, career, technology support, counseling, study abroad. I think there's so much there, but students often don't know about it, or they may not be comfortable using it, or it might be in the wrong place, or it might be offered at the wrong time. And so what they really need to do is like find ways to integrate the support and make it more visible, accessible, normalize getting help. So there isn't like a stigma going to the Writing Center. It's like, oh, you can't write. No, it's like A students go to the Writing Center because they want to keep getting better. Just like Michael Phelps still has a swim coach, right? And he's like the wittiest Olympian ever, crushing it, right? But he can still have a coach. So you could probably have a coach for your writing without that seeming like a bad thing.
That makes perfect sense. And one of the things that I've observed is having faculty involved with advising. I mean, how many folks, when we look back at our college experience, we think about the advisor we had, or we think about the faculty members that we've interacted with? It's always the faculty members.
Oh yeah, the faculty relationship is so key, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because a lot of times people think student engagement, student support, and they automatically gravitate to staff who play an essential and important role, but they can only play part of the role. The faculty, play the other part. And one of my favorite studies is the Gallup-Purdue Index 8-9 years ago, but they found all these great correlations between what students did during college with their life after college. And having a mentor who encouraged you to pursue your dreams made you twice as likely to find meaningful and engaging work after graduation. And it also made you twice as likely to think your education was worth the cost. So I think there's myriad reasons why faculty can drive student engagement and build these relationships. But I think just that one study alone is quite compelling.
And it really leads into the career, the last aspect that we were going to talk about today. If you've got faculty members who can advise you on which way to go from a course perspective to, designing from what the goal is, the backwards thinking, life purpose to career to major, etc.
Right.
And you've got a faculty member who's taking an interest in you to be able to say, hey, you have this gift. This is where I think you should be going. That means everything to a student.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And that same Gallup-Purdue study, they found that students who did internships are also about twice as likely to be engaged at work after graduation and think the education was worth the cost, because internships are one way of making that class to career connection, which I think is so important, because it gives you a way to explore a career path and then a sense of making progress along that path. Like, oh, I did this experiential learning project, instead of just doing a marketing plan in the abstract, I actually talked to a local nonprofit and did a marketing plan with them, for them. And I got some real world experience. So that moved me along my path. My internship moved me along my path. I think there are a lot of great institutions that are not seeing the career as separate from the coursework, and they're trying to, or separate, or in addition, they're trying to blend the two together. I think they're, places like Tulane and Stanford and ASU are, I think, doing really interesting stuff with life design, where Johns Hopkins as well, they just created the Imagine Center, where career planning, life design, academic planning, academic advising, they're all integrated. That it's that same like design ethos, right, of making those connections and thinking holistically. And I think that can really be great. My other favorite example is the Gutman Community College in the CUNY system has this great class called the Ethnographies of Work, where you go out and you shadow people whose job you might want to have in the future. And now maybe you've got a role model, or you can understand their path and maybe work backwards, understand how you can progress along it. So building the class career connections, I think, builds on the support, which builds on the belonging.
Well, those are three really important things. Just to recap, belonging really sets the foundation, but it's also the support for students and career counseling and helping that transition out there. What else have you seen that really works well?
Well, I think providing the support in an integrated, coordinated way, digitally and physically, can't be overlooked, because colleges, universities offer all this amazing stuff, but if students don't know about it or can't get to it, maybe they're working during the day, they can't come to the office between 9 and 5 to sign a paper-based form. By the way, who wants to go anywhere to sign a paper-based form?
Yeah.
Certainly not me. Definitely not a working parent, adult learner. So I think as people are trying to progress from belonging to support to career, thinking about digital and physical one-stop shops is really critical. There's a great RAND report of the community college system that found a 3% retention bump. We did a project at a university to create a new student portal. They experienced a 3% retention bump after that. We've done work to redesign advising to get personal, academic, career, financial support all in one place. We've been doing a lot of work with libraries, kind of reimagining them as student success hubs. So you meet students where they are, and while you're there working on a paper or studying for a test or working on a project, you're also can go to the writing center, can go for a tutoring appointment, can go to the stats lab, can go to the presentation or the communication center and polish things there. So I think that integration, that consolidation, that streamlining of support is so important, because college is getting complicated and it's getting harder and harder to navigate. In that complexity is also some redundancy and cost. It costs students time, it costs staff time, it costs universities money.
I think these are all fascinating things. And one thing comes to mind is with student support and student services, it's changing what students need. I wouldn't say majority, but a good number of students are availing themselves to mental health. And you've got to have those services there. If you're looking at first generation Pella eligible students, you've got to have different support services for them. One of the stories I love is a friend of mine, Russell Lowry Hart at Amarillo College. Back a year, 2 years ago, he had 99 of his students go homeless during one term. They lost only one student because they had already made the arrangements with community services. They were able to help out the students who felt comfortable enough to come in and say, this is the issue. So providing this one-stop shop for students, I think, is so critical for what today's students have to go through.
It is. And, sometimes, maybe it's not a single stop, but sometimes that one-stop shop is a person. There's one person who runs Randy Harris, who runs the Transfer and Returning Student Center at Portland State, one of our clients, and somebody I interviewed for the book. She has this great quote to the effect of, we can't expect students to remember hundreds of different offices and centers where they should go, but we can expect them to know one person and know them well enough to trust them to point them in the right direction. And so sometimes the one stop is a digital or a physical place, but sometimes it's just the opportunity for a student to make that connection with a faculty member, with a staff member, with a peer, and that person is their go-to. And I think in that same National College Health Assessment, more than a third of students have an anxiety diagnosis and about a quarter have a depression diagnosis. And if there's one thing we're seeing across college campuses, it's that the approach to mental health has to be holistic. It can't be like, this is the counseling center problem, right? It has to be everyone's problem, everyone's responsibility. And you need an approach that has to do with peer relationships, belonging, and helping students build a whole network of support. That's advisors, that's faculty, that's other students, that's RAs. And yes, it's the counseling center. You need a team approach, really.
Mm-hmm. And so unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. It always happens. 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards.
Well, I love the opportunity to boil it down. And I'll say that we talked about how universities and colleges can integrate and consolidate and centralize and coordinate their support. And I think that's really important. And I think there's things that students can do in the meantime. I think that, they can also work the problem from both ends. So point number 1 is help students understand that their college experience is not just about them navigating it or getting through it, but it's something they can actively take ownership over. They can design, they can create their experience, and that's how they'll go get the most out of it. And folks want to learn more about that. That's the title and the thesis of my book, How to Get the Most Out of College, on that takes all this research on student success and boils it down in one place. It's kind of a one-stop shop. That's the first point. I think the second point is not seeing the career and the classroom as disconnected, but creating as many overlaps as possible through internships, real-world projects, service learning, externships, bringing alumni into the classroom to talk about their path, their journey. Maybe those alums end up needing interns that summer, or externs that winter. And then I think that the third is that multimodal approach to understanding your students, getting in a rhythm of doing that research and assessment to understand and really take the pulse of your students, go broad, go deep, who they are, what do they need, how are those needs changing, and how are you doing? How do your spaces, your services, your systems, your staff, how are they doing relative to the needs of your community?
Those are great tips. What's next for you? You just mentioned your book.
Yep. How to Get the Most Out of College. I have a podcast as well of the same name, and each one we unpack one of the tips and go into more detail into what to do and why to do it and how to do it for both folks in higher ed as well as students and parents. And I really like being that bridging those two worlds, understanding a lot about how colleges and universities work, and then trying to help students and parents make it work for them. People can check that out at elliefelix.com, and that's where I have all the things I've written and interviews like this one. And the other thing that's next is we're just going to keep doing great work, helping universities adapt and create more engaging and equitable and sustainable experiences for their students, their faculty, their staff, because there are headwinds in higher ed. There are some challenges, but I think it's so important to avoid the ed tech trope of, higher ed is broken and let's use this technology to fix it. And I think about colleges and universities like the way Winston Churchill thought about democracy. It's the worst except for all the others. And I think colleges and universities are amazing, remarkable places, where they do game-changing research and they do transformative learning and they build communities. They're remarkable places. And I just want to be a part of helping colleges and universities adapt and continue to thrive and do so much good in the world.
Elliot, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, and I look forward to being on your show here in a little while.
Absolutely. Take care.
Take care. Thank you. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to our guest, Elliot Felix, CEO of Brightspot Strategy, and for his sharing his knowledge on how institutions can improve their enrollment and retention through improving the student experience. Tune in next week for my conversation with Dr. Kent Ingle, president of Southeastern University. Under Kent's leadership in the last 11 years, he's been at the helm at Southeastern. It has doubled its endowment, doubled the student body, added more than $80 million in new facilities, and has been recognized by the Chronicle of Higher Education as one of the fastest-growing private nonprofit baccalaureate institutions in the country. Until next week, thanks for tuning in.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.